And now from Freedom Fest 2011, Robert Kaufman, author of In Defense of the Bush Doctrine. Mr. Kaufman debates the merits of President George W. Bush's foreign policy with Jacob Hornberger, founder and president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. This is a little over 45 minutes.
It's about that time to get started. Welcome, everyone, to our debate today on the Bush Doctrine, probably one of the most important issues within the political right and a key division between libertarian and conservative thinkers. My name is Brian Kaye, and I am an opinion writer for the Orange County Register and a senior fellow at the Pacific Research Institute. And I'm not going to speak very much today. I'm here to listen, much like you are, on this very, very important issue. And we have two very, very distinguished guests. To my far left, we have Mr. Hornberger, who is here today, and he's the president of and founder of the Future of Freedom Foundation. He was born and raised in Laredo, Texas, and received his BA in economics from Virginia Military Institute and his law degree from the University of Texas. I know we have some other University of Texas people here as well. And he'll be here telling you why he does not believe in the Bush Doctrine. And then we also have, to my direct left, Bob Kaufman, who's a professor at Pepperdine University at the School of Public Policy at Pepperdine. He's written 3 books, including an award-winning book on Henry M. Jackson, and literally, he wrote the book In Defense of the Bush Doctrine, which he thought at the time would land him a spot in the Witness Protection Program. Our debate format today is each of our two debaters will come up here and give a 10-minute introduction, then we'll followed by a 5-minute rebuttal from each, and then we'll open it up to questions from all of you in the audience. There's a microphone right here in front of me, directly in front of me, and there's another microphone right over here. So when we get to the question and answer portion of the debate, I'd ask that you get in line fairly quickly and keep the questions concise, and we appreciate that. So without further ado, let's get our debate underway, and I'd like to ask that John Hornberger come up to the stand.
You know, conservatives used to like to point to the fact that Ronald Reagan brought down the Soviet Union by making it spend its way into bankruptcy, making it spend so much money that the government and the nation essentially went broke. You don't hear conservatives making that point very often these days, and the reason is because the principle applies right here in the United States as well. And everybody's becoming aware of that problem. At the Future of Freedom Foundation, we've been talking about it for 21 years. We've been saying this is a bad road this country's headed down. This is a bad road where the big government advocates, the advocates of the warfare state, of the U.S. empire, of the welfare state, are taking our nation down to uncontrolled spending, debt, inflation, and all that comes with that. And sure enough, that's where we are. And people are starting to figure out, finally, that this big spending problem is a big problem here in the United States. And they're starting to realize that that big spending comes from both the warfare state and the welfare state. And that big spending has consequences. I mean, we see it in terms of violations of financial privacy. We see it in terms of a voracious government that can't borrow enough. We see it, ironically enough, from the government borrowing from the very regime that contributed to the deaths of many people in my generation in the Vietnam War, a war that is still sacred to many of the big government conservatives. And yet they seem to find nothing wrong, nothing immoral, nothing reprehensible about going to one of the most brutal communist regimes in history, a regime that killed many U.S. soldiers in Southeast Asia, and borrowing the money to fund their imperialist adventures in their big warfare state. Now, if you think you're exempt from these problems, think again. Because when they need their money, they will get it. They will nationalize gold when the economic crisis comes, like Franklin Roosevelt, another big government advocate, did. They'll make it a felony offense to own the gold that you're buying here at this conference. They'll even nationalize your IRAs and your 401ks because those are nice, juicy targets because that's what the Argentine government did when it ran out of its money. So this warfare state has consequences. Now, keep in mind also that this is a perpetual war. They themselves will admit it. They have admitted it, that this war goes on forever, this war on terrorism. I mean, from a standpoint of an advocate of big government, this is a dream come true. It's better than the Cold War because, you know, the Berlin Wall might fall unexpectedly. It's better than the war on drugs. This thing goes on forever and ever and ever. In fact, I've written that it's the biggest terrorist-producing machine in history, this U.S. empire. It's an empire that's got bases, 700 to 1,000 bases in some 130 countries. It embargoes, it sanctions, it supports brutal dictators, it invades, it violates wars, makes wars of aggression. This is socialist central planning on a worldwide basis. This is where you've got the U.S. government planning which dictators to support, which ones to oust, which ones to invade, which ones to... Is it any wonder why there's so much chaos and crisis? This is what central planning does. And what they do is they go and create these enemies with their bombs, their invasions, their embargoes. And they sometimes make light of it. For example, when Madeleine Albright, the UN ambassador to the United Nations, told 60 Minutes that sure, the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children from the brutal embargo were worth it. That was her words, worth it. Imagine that. And as they create this anger and rage with statements like that, not to mention the killings, then when the inevitable retaliation comes, they say, oh, the terrorists just hate us for our freedom and values. It has nothing to do with the fact that we've killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children or doing all kinds of other horrible things. It's only Americans that get angry when innocent people are killed on 9/11. But foreigners, oh no, they just hate us for our freedom and values. But when the terrorists were asked why they attacked the World Trade Center in 1993, before 9/11, when they attacked the USS Cole, the Kenya and Tanzania, the embassies there, the statement is consistent. It's because of what your government has done over here that we are retaliating against you. And that's what Ron Paul was making, that point, when he said to Giuliani, the reason they came over here to kill us is because our government's been over there killing them. And then finally, we've got to keep in mind the cost to us as Americans, the loss of our freedom. Because with empire, militarism, embargoes, invasions, wars of aggression, comes the loss of liberty. This is what Madison said. Madison said, of all the enemies to liberty, our liberty, the greatest is war. Because that's when our government becomes the greatest threat to our freedoms. That's what Madison was saying. Because with wars comes armies and standing armies and debts, taxes, inflation, bureaucracy, centralization of power, the war on terrorism, socialism, and of course the nation-building exercise where they send these socialist projects in to rebuild the nations they destroyed. And all this while, we lose our freedoms. You've got the Patriot Act, where, you've got the power to issue search warrants that even King George would have been embarrassed to have. They sneak into people's homes, Americans' homes, and don't even tell them, and search, and never even notify them. They go into banks with national security letters that they write themselves. They don't even get a warrant. And it's all to search your records or records of your fellow Americans. It's remindful of that old quote, I think it was Cardinal Newman, that said first they came for the communists and they came for this group and this group and this group, but we all stayed silent until they came for us. Because you see, these people in this regime, in this warfare state, they have the power now to take Americans into custody thanks to this warfare state imperial foreign policy. They have the power to seize us, cart us away as an enemy combatant in the war on terrorism. No judicial process. It is the ultimate in tyranny. This is the power that these U.S.-supported dictators in the Middle East have. The power that people are rebelling against, that they're asking to lift. The power to take any American into custody, cart him away, torture him, indefinitely incarcerate him, or even assassinate him, which is now the power that they've self-assumed. This is not a good road we're on. This is not a road. If you're interested in freedom, there is no way you're going to find it under a welfare, warfare, imperial state. And this is what we've been arguing for 21 years. You want a free society? Then you've got to dismantle this thing. You got to bring all the troops home. Discharge them. Cold War's over. Bring them home from Germany. Get them out of Japan. They don't want them in Japan anyway. Bring them out of Korea, South America, where they're being used as cops in the drug war. Bring them all home and discharge them. Close all those bases, including Guantanamo Bay. Liberate the American people. Liberate the private sector. You see, their philosophy is isolate the American people, the private sector, unleash the federal government on the world. Our philosophy is rein in the federal government, bring it, isolate it, and liberate the American people, the private sector, to travel, trade, and interact with the people of the world. This is the way out of this thing. And so for the advocates of big government, if you love big government, if you love the taxes, the spending, the crisis, the permanent environment of catastrophe and color codes, then keep on this road. Keep supporting the welfare warfare state, the imperialist foreign policy. But if you want a free society before you die, if you want to know what it's like to live the life of a free man and a free woman, then join up with us, those of us that are calling for a dismantling of the empire and a restoration of the American Republic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kaufman.
My distinguished debating partner reminds me of John Calhoun. Eloquent, handsome, passionate, and wrong. The United States will not be safer or more prosperous if the United States disengages from the world. That's what history teaches us. I thought this debate was supposed to be about the Bush Doctrine, so I'll actually give you some information about what the Bush Doctrine is, what it stipulates, and how it fits grandly into the best of the American tradition. The Bush Doctrine came out of the heinous attacks of 9/11. There are two principal premises to the Bush Doctrine. One is that in this day and age, there are certain types of threats emanating from certain types of actors that can't be dealt with by conventional strategies of containment or deterrence. You need to respond preemptively because for some threats, if you wait too long, it's like cancer. That's premise one. The second premise is that in the Middle East in particular, the root cause of this dangerous synergy between the spread of weapons and mass destruction and radicalism was the culture of tyranny in the region. Now let's be precise. The Bush Doctrine does not say that you go to war with somebody if they are a tyranny. If, however, a regime poses a grave threat to you and you do get in a war, the remedy for that is to deal with the root cause of it and to transform the nature of the regime. That second aspect of the Bush Doctrine, regime change in war when someone has brought war to you, it's not novel, it's tried and true. In virtually every war the United States has involved itself since World War I, we've rightly identified the nature of the regime we were fighting as the root cause of the conflict, and we deemed to change it. We were right. The problem in World War I was not our intervention, it was the opposite. By withdrawing from Europe too soon, by withdrawing from the world as my eloquent debate partner advocated, we didn't make ourselves more prosperous and secure. We didn't make the world safe for democracy. We made it safe for Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, and Tojo. We didn't make that mistake after World War II. Ronald Reagan brilliantly conducted the end of the Cold War, dedicated to transforming a Soviet regime that he rightly identified as the root cause of the conflict. After World War II, similarly, Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill rightly identified the nature of the Nazi regime and the nature of the Imperial Japanese regime as the root cause of those conflicts. Not wanting World War III, we determined to change those regimes. We were right, we succeeded. As for preemption, the Bush Doctrine does not say preemption is justified under any circumstance. What it does say is that whether you use force sooner or later is a prudential judgment that depends on the circumstances, the gravity of the danger, the alternative strategies available, the consequence of waiting too long. For we know from history that there are times that using force sooner, to quote Churchill, can save much blood, toil, tears, and sweat later. One was in the 1930s when we waited too long with Hitler. Another was in 1940 when Churchill preemptively destroyed the Vichy French fleet harbored in Oran. A third event was the Israeli decision rightly to destroy the Osiris reactor in May of 1981, without which Saddam Hussein would have had nuclear weapons by the time of the first Gulf War. One final thought on the cost of all this. The Bush Doctrine does not say you go to war with everybody to change the nature of their regime. What it says is when there is a concatenation of circumstances, a gathering danger, a tyranny that threatens us, the lack of alternatives, sometimes using force sooner is better than using force later. As for the cost of this endeavor, we've heard a lot of adjectives about the warfare state. Let's be precise. Right now, the defense budget is 4.7% of the GDP, compared to 6.6% under Ronald Reagan, 8.6% under John F. Kennedy. The problem is not military spending, the problem is domestic spending. Ronald Reagan knew that. As Ronald Reagan often said, when he rejected isolationism, when he decried appeasement, when he identified Churchill as the greatest hero of the 20th century, Reagan said, "It takes generations to build freedom. You can lose it in a generation, and if you do lose it, it's often going to be because you withdrew from your responsibilities in the world." My handsome, eloquent colleague quoted actually Dietrich Bonhoeffer, not Cardinal Newman, when he was citing examples of what happens when you wake up and you find you have no friends. Actually, the quote proves the opposite point. Bonhoeffer was making that observation, decrying appeasement and withdrawal in the 1930s that exponentially raised the cost of dealing with Hitler. There are gathering dangers in the world which only American power can deal with. You don't want to do it, but the alternatives to not doing it are infinitely worse.
Do you want to you can go back up there.
Well, I never thought I'd see anyone ever defend World War I. I mean, that's absolutely phenomenal. If there was ever an example of a horrendous, failed, ill-advised military adventure, it's got to be World War I. I mean, what a total waste of American life. Bob, let me remind you, this was the war to end all wars. This was the war to bring democracy to the world. This is your ideal. This is the war to end everything, all the other wars in the future. And all it did is produce the circumstances for the rise of Adolf Hitler and the rise of World War II 20 years later. And it's interesting that, conservatives love to defend World War II, and then in the very next breath, he talks about how important it was to stop the Soviet threat. Do I need to remind him that the Soviet Union was their partner in World War II, their ally? Do I need to remind him that at the end of World War II, the big government people had turned over all of Eastern Europe and East Germany to the Soviet partner, the Soviet ally, that they then turned into an enemy soon thereafter that would justify ever-increasing military expenditures throughout the Cold War, not to mention hot wars in Korea that cost 50,000 American men, Vietnam, and on and on. By their fruits you will know them. Bob says, oh, we're only going to have regime change when they attack us, when they're a threat to us. Has he not heard of Iran in 1953 when the CIA effected a regime change operation there because the British were mad because Mossadegh, the prime minister, who had been democratically elected, had nationalized British oil interests? Has he not heard of Guatemala in 1954 where the CIA went in there and ousted the democratically elected president of that country? I mean, this is why we have the blowback from Iran today. This is why there were more than 1 million people killed in Guatemala's civil war. And then he talks about that it's only 4% of GDP and we don't need to worry about military spending. This is what we hear from the liberals, that we can't do anything about, aid to the public broadcasting network or to Medicare, the Medicaid, or Social Security, because it's all each individually a very small portion of the problem. Well, they're spending more on military armaments more than all other nations combined. This is a warfare state. Make no mistake about it. When you've got 1,000 or 700 military bases all over the world, that's an expensive process. And that includes the country clubs where all the generals and admirals got to take their families for vacation. When you're occupying 2 countries, that is a major contribution to the fiscal problems that this country is facing. It was, I think it was John Quincy Adams that said, this country does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. When they went against Iraq, when they invaded Iraq, I guarantee you no Iraqi citizen or the Iraqi president who had been their ally had attacked the United States. Why were they so convinced that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction? Because they had the receipts. Because they were the ones that had furnished the weapons of mass destruction to him during the 1980s. Why? So that he could kill Iranians who had had the audacity to oust the Shah of Iran that the big government people had put into power as part of their regime change operations. This is U.S. foreign policy. This is what it has produced for us. Nothing but bad consequences. And you know what the biggest immorality of this that Bob has yet to talk about? It's very easy to talk about regime change, ousting a dictator or supporting a dictator. What he didn't talk about is the number of people he has to kill to achieve that. How many people have been killed in Iraq in that regime change operation, where there were no WMDs, where they invaded now for freedom and democracy? How many people have been killed, destroyed? We don't even know because they don't keep count. There was never an upward limit on the number of Iraqi people that they, the interventionists, would use to justify this foreign policy. Any number of Iraqis was worth it to kill, just like there was any number of Iraqi children that could die. That's what angers people overseas. That's what gets them so angry, that callousness toward human life in the Middle East and elsewhere. And of course, he never talked about the loss of freedom that this policy produces for us, the American people. That is the cost of their empire. That is the cost of their militarism. That is the cost, the loss of our freedom. To keep us safe, he wants to keep us safe. But as we know, when you trade your liberty for safety, you get neither one.
Ironies abound. I didn't think that at a conservative conference I would be debating the son that George McGovern always wanted, calling us for Come Home America. But here we are. Some history lessons. The problem with World War I was that we left Europe after World War I, as my debate partner suggested, making the world safe for the dictators. Secondly, the reason we had to rely on the Soviet Union during the Second World War was the ill fruits of the policy of appeasement, which squandered a material advantage to such a degree that by the time we woke up belatedly to the gathering danger, we had no choice but to make a devil's bargain. Had we stayed in Europe in the first place and had something akin to NATO during the Cold War, we wouldn't have been in that position. People who advocate intervention, or at least me, we're not callous to human life. On the contrary, look at Iraq before the American intervention. Saddam Hussein had killed 500,000 of his own people. He had launched a war against Iran that resulted in the death of 1 million people. He had used poison gas against his own population, against Iranians. He had violated 17 UN resolutions. He had committed an act of war, mounting an assassination attempt against an American president. Also, if you read the Kay Commission and Dilfer report, you'll find out two things. One, when we went into Iraq after the first war, we found that Saddam was much closer to achieving nuclear weapons capability than we had thought. Two, Saddam certainly behaved as if he had nuclear weapons, and indeed he thought he did. And thirdly, the Dilfer report concluded that had we not intervened in Iraq in 2003, Saddam had the infrastructure where inevitably he would have acquired those weapons with the propensity to take risk and use anything he had based on past performance. Unfortunately, for all you in the audience who say, well, this is all in the realm of speculation, we're going to have a test of these two rival theories. Under the Obama administration, which is disengaging under multilateral rhetoric, Iran is going to acquire nuclear weapons. Will we be safer with a nuclear Iran? Final thought for those who think we are a warfare state. And do this as a thought experiment for the past 100 years, including today. Suppose the United States did not exist. Choose your region. Will East Asia be more tranquil, more secure, more free, more safe, leaving it up to the Chinese, the Russians, and the Japanese? Will Europe be more free or safe, leaving it up to the Germans and the Russians once again? Is the Middle East really a region of tranquility but for the machinations and the imperialism of the United States? We are not a perfect nation. We have made mistakes, but my eloquent debate partner has committed the fallacy of moral equivalence. For all the problems of the United States, for all the mistakes we've made, American power is central to any decent scheme of provisional justice in the 20th century and in the foreseeable future.
Thank you. Now we have time for questions from the audience. If anyone has a question, there's a microphone right here, right directly in front of me. Just line up, and let's keep our questions fairly concise so we can hear more from our debaters, because I felt Jacob to my left writing furiously, so he has a lot he wants to get to.
Is this on? Do I need to do something here?
Go ahead.
So one of the policy speeches that I think is considered one of the fundamental times where Bush laid out the Bush Doctrine was was in the spring of '02 at West Point. I had the interesting opportunity to be in the audience for that speech and spend most of the last decade over trying to solve the nation building and Iraq problem. And I guess I wanted to talk a little bit specifically about Iraq. We've mentioned a couple of times. I'm curious to hear both of your perspectives. I think it poses a problem on both sides. I think for the pro-Bush Doctrine argument, you can say this was way harder, took way longer, and had significantly more corollary effects than we had anticipated. But on the anti-Bush Doctrine argument, I think you also have to look at Iraq right now and think it's very possible that that's the most stable democracy in the Middle East. And we do have a strategic interest there. I guess I'm just curious, more specifically, your thoughts on what we've done in Iraq over the last 8 years.
That's a perceptive question, and I defend Iraq going in and the ultimate outcome, admitting that Clausewitz says war is friction. we made mistakes, and the war went through 3 phases. In the first phase, the military phase, we did much better than expected. In the second phase, the counterinsurgency phase, we made significant mistakes until David Petraeus was the General Sherman to President Bush and saved us. Iraq is much better off now than it was under Saddam Hussein. Iraq also has the potential to be a decent, open society, decent to its neighbors in a region that doesn't have much decency. Let me also add that I grieve for each of the over 4,000 men and women who died as patriots. Indeed, I dedicated my Bush Doctrine book to a Marine I knew who lost his life early. But we've tended to lose perspective on cost. 4,000 plus dead is significant, but we lost 13,000 dead in December of 1862 with Ambrose Burnside charging up a hill in Fredericksburg. What strikes me as being remarkable, to tell you the truth, is how quickly we learned, despite our mistakes, to fight a counterinsurgency war in a region that historically had been unyielding to freedom. So I give tremendous credit to the brave men and women of the military and to General Petraeus's brilliant implementation of a brilliant strategy. Having said that, for all the complaints about Iraq, no one has asked for Saddam Hussein or his family back. I think that tells you something significant for all the problems.
Thank you. Jacob?
Yeah, let me tell you who is not better off as a result of the invasion of Iraq. It's the dead people. It's the people they killed. It's the 100,000s of Iraqis. Notice his mindset. It's what I've always found fascinating about conservatives. He talks about the troops. He sympathizes with those 4,000 troops. He says this is a cost, but it was a cost worth bearing. They never consider a cost of the people they're killing in order to bring freedom, what they call freedom, and democracy to a nation. That's what angers people over there. The hundreds of thousands of people they've killed are not better off. They are dead. And that's the cavalier attitude that characterizes this imperialist foreign policy. They don't have the moral authority to invade a country, to oust a dictator, knowing that they're going to be killing hundreds of thousands of people. For them, it becomes a cost-benefit analysis. Oh, was it worth it? Well, sure. How many Iraqis did you have to kill to do this? Who cares? Any number. Any number we killed. We don't even know the number. We don't care. Any number is worth bringing this freedom and democracy to this land. That's the fundamental immorality of the conservative cause in foreign policy.
That's not fair. In fact, if you look at the data and the facts, Saddam Hussein killed vastly more people than we killed liberating Iraq, and now Iraqis have a chance. If you look at the actual cost of leaving Saddam in power, this is a morally as well as geopolitically defensible war.
But you see, it's a cost-benefit analysis. You're saying he was killing this X number, so we're going to go and kill this number, and that's worth it. I'm arguing that from a religious perspective, a moral perspective, a spiritual perspective, you don't have that moral authority to make that call. And notice the founding fathers of this country, what their remedy was. Their remedy was, we will not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. We will not free you from tyranny, but we will let you come to this country if you can get out of that tyranny, and you will come to a free country and we won't repatriate you. Today, conservatives take the exact opposite position. We will unleash our bombs on you because we love you, but we want to close our borders to you because we're scared that you're going to be bringing all these dangerous immigrants into the United States.
Let's take a question from over here.
To the gentleman from Pepperdine, I personally didn't see Saddam Hussein as a threat, again, remembering that he was our former ally, and we basically were supporting him for many years. But I want to bring it a little more current to Libya, and maybe Obama's following that Bush Doctrine. Was Libya a threat to us because he killed some of his citizens as compared to, let's say, Syria or other countries that are killing their citizens? In other words, where do you draw the line for intervening in foreign nations?
Let me disentangle several remarks. One, we did not, quote unquote, support Saddam in the 1980s. We, under Reagan, gave Saddam no military equipment, very limited help, because, as Henry Kissinger rightly put it during the Iran-Iraq war, it's too bad either side couldn't lose. We had a geopolitical interest because of the terrible choices in giving each side just enough help so that neither ended up dominating. As for Libya, people like me and Victor Davis Hanson, a supporter of the Bush Doctrine, don't support the war in Libya for a variety of reasons, one of which it's under the auspices of the United Nations. Two, it has an ill-defined mission. Three, it is going to yield gridlock because it's too little to get rid of Gaddafi. Four, unlike Iraq, Gaddafi since 2003 has not been a major threat. He dismantled his nuclear weapons, and he is infinitely less murderous since 2003 than the gathering in danger of Iran and their surrogates in Syria. So if you take the combination of moral and geopolitical analysis at the heart of the Bush Doctrine, you actually do not support nation building everywhere, and certainly you don't support it under the United Nations. You do it based on Don Rumsfeld's coalition of the willing. What Samuel Johnson said of a second marriage is true of the United Nations dealing with anything, particularly security. It's a triumph of hope over experience. So you can accuse me of many things as a defender of the Bush Doctrine. I don't deserve to bear the burden of this Libyan fiasco.
Well, first of all, you might want to Google Rumsfeld photo shaking hands Saddam Hussein, and you can see the famous photo of Donald Rumsfeld shaking hands with Saddam Hussein when the U.S. was, yes, partnering and allying with Saddam Hussein. In fact, if you go to our website, fff.org, type in on the search engine, "Where did Iraq get?" you will see all the articles that we document that it was the Western powers that were furnishing Saddam Hussein with those weapons of mass destruction. Why? Because he was helping to kill Iranians, and the U.S. was mad at Iran because they had had the audacity to oust the Shah of Iran and install a regime that the U.S. didn't approve of. Now, it's easy for him to say, oh, well, see, Libya's different. But who makes the call? It's very subjective. What's a threat to national interest? Who gets to make that subjective call? Certainly not the Congress, because you see, they support wars of aggression, undeclared wars. Our Constitution says you need a congressional declaration of war before you can wage war. And you know, conservatives have always stood for the Constitution. But then when you ask them, what about that provision? Well, no, we want the president to have dictatorial powers to determine what's a threat and what's not a threat. Well, Obama's just making the same subjective determination that Bush did with Iraq. He's saying, hey, country's a threat. It's going to be a threat in the future. A dictator there killing his own people. Let's go in there and wipe him out the same way that Bush went into Iraq to get rid of Saddam.
Yeah, Aristotle said the mark of intelligence is to make reasonable distinctions. In October of 2002, President Bush obtained from the Senate a 77 to 23, then John Kerry changed his mind, 78 to 22, authorization for the war. George W. Bush sought congressional approval, whereas President Obama has deliberately bypassed the Congress in favor of the United Nations, NATO, and the Arab League. That's fundamentally different in terms of legitimacy.
Excuse me, but President Bush did not secure a congressional declaration of war, which the law requires him to do.
No, it does not. If you read the Constitution and you read John Woo's interpretation of it, it is not a requirement that you seek a declaration of war. It is a requirement that you seek congressional sanction, and the president, even Obama, doesn't have dictatorial powers because Congress, as it did in Vietnam in 1975, can call any war to a halt by suspending funding.
The framers said that Congress shall be delegated the power to declare war. And what the Congress did was delegate to the president, unconstitutionally, the power to declare war in Iraq. That is a fundamental distinction.
In the interest of time, and because I know we're not going to settle this here today, let's have our closing remarks from both of our esteemed debaters, and we'll start over here with Bob.
The Founding Fathers, when they defined America's role in the world, if you look at Washington's farewell address, envisaged the United States becoming a great global power. Their standard of disengagement from the world was a contingent strategy suited to the age of sail, where we were weak in the world of the strong. Since the 20th century, a concatenation of technical conditions and geopolitical ones means that for the United States to provide for the common defense, it must assume a major role in maintaining equilibrium and, if possible, fostering liberty in the major geopolitical power centers of the world. That does not mean everywhere, because for all nations, even as powerful as the United States, resources are finite. It does mean that the United States was infinitely wiser staying in Europe after World War II than leaving it in World War I. It does mean that Ronald Reagan was right to decry appeasement of Hitler as a suicidal dogma and to warn against the dangers of American strategic withdrawal. It does mean that President Bush was correct that in today's technical and political circumstances, there are dangers that require preemptive reaction rather than other strategies. If you withdraw from the world, the United States will be less free, less secure, and the world will be more dangerous. The greatest conservative statesmen of the 20th century, Ronald Reagan and Winston Churchill, knew that. We would be remiss not to heed their lessons for the 21st century. Thank you for your forbearance.
In making the choice as to where we go as a nation, it's important that we not make a mistake that people often make, and that is that conflating the American people with the federal government. You know, it's not sufficient to just talk in terms of the United States should do this or the United States should do that. We're talking about two separate groups of people, and that distinction is recognized in the Constitution. It's recognized in the Bill of Rights, which protects us, the people, the private sector, from the federal government. So when we talk about reining in the federal government, we're not talking about reining in the private sector. You know, the world loves the American people. I've traveled abroad. Foreigners love Americans. They love tourists. They love, businessmen, cultural groups. That's what we've got to unleash on the world. That's the isolationism we need to stop that they have brought to us. We liberate the private sector, but we bring in the government sector. The government sector that is out there bombing people and killing people and embargoing people and producing these perpetual enemies for the United States. We've had 2 centuries now to compare against. We've had a century of a republic. Okay, not perfect by any means at all. Now we've had a century as an empire. What do we want? Where do we go from here? I mean, we're heading into a bankruptcy situation. We've got what Madison said, debts and taxes, overarching government. TSA body searches and groping of children and spouses and so forth. We got bank financial privacy. We got confiscation, nationalizations, socialism, nation building. I mean, what more socialism could you have than a nation building project? So this is the choice that's facing us. And most important of all is your freedom. Do you want to be free? And that's what you got to ask yourself. If freedom's not important to you, if it's not your top value, then by golly, go ahead and keep supporting all this stuff, this interventionism and this perpetual war on terrorism and the perpetual production of terrorism, because they will use as the excuse to keep us safe. But to keep us safe, they have to take away our freedoms. And if that's not important to you, if freedom's not important to you, then that's fine. But what we're saying here is there's a way out of here. If there was no way out, it'd be a very depressing situation. The reason that we libertarians are so hopeful is because there's a way out. It entails restoring the principles of liberty on which this country was founded, the principles of a constitutionally limited republic, where we make these people comply with our law. They make us comply with their laws. Why shouldn't they comply with our laws, including that declaration of war requirement? Impeach them when they violate it. Oust them from office legally. This is the choice that's facing us as Americans right now, and the reality is here. Because if we continue traveling this road, I think everybody knows the end of this road. You're talking about oppression, you're talking about nationalization, confiscation, capital controls, seizure, impoverishment through the massive consumption of capital. You come to our road, you're talking about peace, harmony, prosperity, accumulation of capital, the decentralization of power out of Washington. This is the key to a peaceful, harmonious, prosperous society. Thank you very much.
And thank you all for attending this debate. Obviously, like I said, it wasn't settled today, but I want to once again thank Bob Kaufman to my right and Jacob Hornberger to my left. And if you think that you were in the hot seat, being in between these guys and they're going back and forth, that's a scary place to be. Thanks very much.
This event was part of Freedom Fest, a libertarian conference held annually in Las Vegas. To find out more, visit freedomfest.com.